What about military support? What kind of military support has the PLA given to Venezuela and the Maduro regime?
So they've given about upwards of about $1 billion in foreign military sales. And so, Russia's the big player when it comes to military armament. They gave upward of $12 billion to Venezuela or sold in military armament. China's not far. China's far behind, but it's I think number 3 on the list of Venezuela. But some of that armament is very useful to the regime in terms of their strategies of how they're going to destabilize their neighbors. One, for instance, is our anti-ship harpoon missiles. And that's something that I think Venezuela has been experimenting with very recently as it looks to basically encroach on some of its neighbors. And we could talk about that in a second, but it's focusing on Guyana. I call Guyana the little Taiwan of Latin America because much like Taiwan, Venezuela proclaims that as their territory. They have a 100-year-old border dispute, but really the Venezuelan regime, mostly Hugo Chavez and Maduro, really did nothing about this issue until several years ago when Guyana discovered 11 billion barrels of oil in the maritime zone of their territory. And so that's one of the biggest oil discoveries in the world in recent years. And since then, Maduro has been basically building capabilities to encroach upon Guyana. And I call it the Little Taiwan because it has all the same elements of territorial integrity issues, sovereignty issues, democracy, but also it's a maritime issue because of the oils in the water. And just in the last month, when Maduro came back from Beijing, he spent about 10 days, maybe 12 days in Beijing in September. In fact, Xi Jinping, I believe, missed the G20 because he was with Maduro in China. When he came back, he immediately began his Guyana offensive. It basically created a national referendum in Venezuela. And this is the big thing about that because I call it the checkmate against the Venezuelan opposition and his ace in the sleeve on the international community. It's a checkmate on the opposition because 99%, just to not say 100, of Venezuelans will probably agree with Maduro. They all believe that territory, it's called the Essequibo, that territory, which is 3/4 of Guyana, is theirs. They believe that was unjustly taken away from them in terms of territorial conquest. And I say it's an ace in the sleeve of the international community because no one's going to defend Guyana. They have no defense agreements with any country in the world.
So this is a huge thing for a small country because the GDP of Guyana is only about 8 billion, right? But you said 11 billion barrels of oil?
Yeah, was discovered.
So we're talking about like $1 trillion worth of oil, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So a tiny country with $1 trillion oil supply, like that's a hard thing to manage if you're a small country because you have to have your own security, to deal with that issue, right? So is the Chinese Communist Party? They're seeing this obviously, seeing this little country probably can't handle that much oil. So how is the CCP getting involved directly in Guyana?
So this is an interesting, also a bit complex issue because you're right. Once they made that oil discovery, Guyana became from basically becoming a country that most people didn't pay attention to in regional or international affairs to a focus, not so much on the political side, but mostly on the economic side of major international investors. ExxonMobil moved very quickly to get some concessions into those oil deposits to begin exploring and figuring out how to refining. China did as well. And so China, along with ExxonMobil, began to get concessions on some of that oil. But here's the trick. And this is something I think that the Guyanese need to understand very well. China does a very good job, and they do this throughout the world, and we're going to talk about this in this case, at playing both arson and firefighter on these type of situations. So they empower the Maduro regime to basically destabilize those territorial waters and go after and basically kick ExxonMobil out. And then they go to Guyana and say, we're going to help you solve your Venezuela problem. And so that's China's method on this. And it's created some divisions within the Guyanese government because obviously China is a major economic player in their country. But they also know that Maduro took that trip to Beijing. They kind of see, I think their national security apparatus sees the kind of double discourse on behalf of China. But when you're indebted, when your dependency economically is tied to China, it creates a conundrum. But I think this is really the United States where we dropped the ball because I'll give you a very specific example. About a year ago, you remember after Russia invaded Ukraine, the Biden administration went to Venezuela to talk about offsetting the oil that would be disrupted because of the sanctions that were being placed on the Russian Federation. Not to mention that Venezuela's oil enterprise is pretty much gutted because they destroyed their country. But that never made sense for another reason as well. That never made sense because instead of negotiating with Maduro to get oil, they weren't even looking at Guyana next door that had the potential with much more oil. They just needed the ability to have service loans to be able to build the infrastructure so that they can export and refine that oil. Basically, they wanted specifically a loan to build port infrastructure. Going back to the Inter-American Development Bank, the American Development Bank by this time had already gotten rid of the first American president that ever served in the bank. They were able to get rid of him. And then the Inter-American Development Bank, and I believe through the pressure of the Biden administration, blocked that loan to Guyana. And so then China came in and said, we'll help you with the port infrastructure. My point to that is the Biden administration has been doing everything to not help Guyana develop the capabilities to actually have the real infrastructure to service that 11 billion barrels of oil discovery, and doing everything to appease the Maduro regime and allow them to gain legitimacy. And that's going to be felt when Maduro starts making his moves on Guyana.
Well, Biden has publicly talked a lot about his climate change initiatives and green initiatives. And so isn't oil antithetical to that? And that's why he's doing it? Or is it some other reason why he's neglecting Guyana?
Honestly, he would probably say, he could say that. He could say a bunch of things. He said the reason he went to Venezuela to talk to Maduro was because they wanted to offset the oil that they were going to lose from Russia. I think it's all just hogwash, to be honest with you, because I think fundamentally they have cut deals with the most authoritarian regimes in the world. We know a little bit about what they've done with Iran. We obviously are always focused on what they can do with China. But fundamentally, I think in Latin America, Venezuela is the most authoritarian regime in the region. And the Biden administration has been negotiating to ease the sanctions that were imposed on the regime with many different arguments. Some are coherent, some are less coherent than others. But fundamentally, I think it's with this kind of philosophy of appeasing your adversary, that if you appease your adversary, they're somehow not going to be as aggressive. And you could ask Israel how that's played out.
One thing I find interesting about this is, it's not just the countries of Latin America that China is trying to influence. China is also working very closely with a lot of the cartels. These cartels are getting precursors from China. They're also doing a lot of money laundering, weapons supply. And so it just seems like the Chinese Communist Party is somehow balancing a lot of very conflicting interests in the region.
No, yeah, I think this falls under the unrestricted warfare of China. They have this, you could, and I have the book, it's there, and we've studied it, but really, it really comes down to just, anything goes, anything short of kinetic that they can employ falls within their warfare mindset. And China's, I think their whole strategy is encompassed on submission, on getting the United States to lose its will to fight before the fight even begins. And so I think the organized crime elements are a big part of that. There was a lot of debate here in Washington about the fentanyl trafficking, because we all know that the precursor chemicals that are used for the labs in Mexico come from China. And this was, this was a balloon effect. They used to come straight to the United States, but when to the Postal Service. And then when the DA got really sharp on that and they clamped it down, the balloon effect took place. And then that's where the connections with the cartels in Mexico started to blossom. But most of it is, is Chinese organized crime elements that are bringing that over and working with the cartels in Mexico. But so part of the debate was, how much does the CCP, how much is the Chinese government involved in this? And I thought it was a silly debate, because we're talking about China as if it was Switzerland. Like, they just don't have any view of what's going on in their country. This is a country that has probably the most draconian drug laws internally, but does nothing for shipping drugs externally. Like, I think the penalty for being caught laundering money or shipping drugs is like a civil fine if you're doing it externally. If you're consuming it internally, you get maximum penalties, and even I think death sentences, death penalties in some cases. So that already showed you it's kind of like it's similar to the COVID, where they shut the flights down internally to China, but they allowed all the external flights to continue flying out. That kind of continued with that pattern in terms of the organized crime elements. China being one of the largest illicit money outflows in the world. The second thing was, in Mexico, when the fentanyl trafficking started to boom, and this is around the 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, it started to really skyrocket. we started to see a phenomenon of bankers and brokers that were really facilitating this trafficking. The cartels were on the ground building the routes, the distribution networks, doing what they do. The Chinese criminal organizations were the ones involved with the shipping. They were moving the stuff through ships and later through plane flights. But really, the middlemen, the people that were really making the deals, were these bankers and brokers that from China. And if you study some of this, and there's actually a big case, and I forgot the name right now off the top of my head, but there's a very prominent case that was investigated by the DEA about this individual, this network of Chinese nationals in California that came down to Mexico. They actually called themselves Chinaloa because they were working with the Sinaloa cartel. And when you look at them, they had close ties to the PRC. And this goes to the kind of the fundamental notion that China's a communist, centralized, controlled country. They know their banking system. They know what comes in, what comes out. They're not ambivalent to what's happening in terms of organized crime. They don't want it to affect internally, but if it affects externally, and particularly if it affects adversarial nations like the United States, not only do they permit it, but they facilitate it. And this case, and then several others I hear that are starting to unravel, are starting to show that it's basically the bankers and the brokers that are allowing us to see the nexus between the Chinese government, Chinese organized crime, and the Mexican cartels.